Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Collins, high quality student books, teacher guides and unbeatable value revision for GCSE and A-level sociology. Now, Sociology Show listeners can get 25% off Collins sociology resources until the end of December 2021. And that includes a new book, How to Be a Sociologist, an inspiring introduction to studying sociology at A-level and at university. If you would like to take up this offer, then simply head to collins.co.uk/sociology show and enter the code sociology show at the checkout. Terms and conditions apply. But as I say, that offer runs all the way up till December 2021. The Sociology Show podcast is also brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialists for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit their website, which is tutor2u.net/sociology. And there you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so in this episode, we're doing another re-release. It's someone that people have asked me to talk to. Perhaps they didn't know that I've already spoken to him. A really, really popular writer. You've probably seen his name pop up in your packs or textbooks if you're studying A-level in particular. So let's go over to the interview with Professor Les Back. My guest for this episode was Professor Les Back from Goldsmiths University. I first became aware of Les's work when I read the 2001 book, Changing Face of Football. And as a football fan myself, it really got me interested and intrigued about the ideas of racism, both on the pitch, but also what's going on in the terraces as well. And so it was a real honour to be able to chat to Les, both about this book, but also about ideas of race, racism research in wider society and beyond as well. And so without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Do you want to start by introducing yourself, please?
Oh, it's a pleasure. My name is Les Back. I teach sociology at Goldsmiths College.
And Les, where did sociology start for you? Where was you first introduced to the subject?
Well, it's funny, because I came into sociology a little bit by the back door. I didn't study sociology, although, I was always fascinated by my friends who were studying sociology. I studied at Goldsmiths College. I started out doing a geography degree, actually, and geography was such a stifling environment in those days. Now everyone wants to be a cultural geographer, but it wasn't like that in the early 1980s. It was all about rocks and maps, So I started out doing geography. I liked geography at school, partly because it was the closest I could get to the things that felt like that were important to me. The experience of city life. I'd grown up on the edge of, in the suburbs of London on a big council estate where families were moved out to, from the inner London areas. It felt like a very stultifying environment. I was looking for resources to try and make sense of it. First went to geography, I guess, as at A-level, and then ended up at Goldsmiths doing this degree in geography, which was a nightmare to me at the beginning. And a wonderful woman called Nikki Nelson, an anthropologist, came into the class one day. It was such a wonderful moment. And she stood there, very charismatic, quite short, petite woman with long red hair, an American anthropologist. She said, I'll never forget it. She said, well, if rocks and strata make your heart beat faster, then anthropology isn't for you. And me and my mate looked at each other and said, okay, we put our hands up, like, where can we join? So my route into sociology was via anthropology. So I did a joint honours degree in anthropology and geography, then went on and did a PhD in anthropology. But I was interested in not a faraway shore in a way. I was interested in the resources that a kind of ethnographic sensibility could give you to understand the familiar, the near at hand. Those things that were both incredibly proximate and total mysteries at the same time. Because that as a young person, the experience of growing up in the late 1970s, early 1980s was one of deep crisis, where there was a kind of cultural and political earthquake going on around questions of identity, of politics, of class, of ethnicity and race and racism. It was this extraordinarily torrid time. And in a way, the first steps into anthropology gave me some resources to try and make sense of that. And then I worked after finishing my PhD as a contract researcher, and had always done research in the UK, with one exception actually that came later. And I found myself at the Institute of Education first, and then after that at Birkbeck College, and after that at the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, or what it became after, in Birmingham, and then came back to Goldsmiths to teach sociology.
You came full circle. You came back again.
I came full circle, yeah.
Yeah. And do you mind saying whereabouts in London did you grow up? Was it quite a multicultural area in itself?
Well, it was I've written about it a lot, actually. My family is sort of scattered through the southeast of London. And I grew up in a place called New Addington in Croydon. My family were moved there in 1966. In fact, it's family legend that we moved in on the day of the World Cup final. It was interesting because that there's a kind of ring of London where large, because there was such a huge housing crisis at that time, large numbers of affordable homes were being built in spaces where there was a space to accommodate them. John Greenwood writes brilliantly about this in a book called Concretopia. And the sort of vision of affordable housing for working people in healthier environments was a noble one. But as a young person, it was an incredibly stultifying environment. You felt like you were in a place with no history, no past, no sense of things. Good reason that punk rock comes out of that sort of space. The blankness of that space. And the estate that I lived on was predominantly white, but the youth community of that estate was more diverse than the sort of parent culture, if you like.
Yeah.
So there was this tension between, on the one hand, the fact that there were people from very different backgrounds at school. At the same time, in local areas, they were predominantly white. I remember, openly fascist groups like the National Front leafleting outside my school. In 1977, when the National Front marched through Lewisham, famously the Battle of Lewisham, I remember people being there on both sides. And in a way, the tension between that was the thing that focused my imagination and commitments. On the one hand, a stirring and a yearning for a different sense of what it could mean to be both a Londoner and British, and at the same time, how that sense of place and self was constantly damaged by the legacy of racism and of empire. Actually, how those things permeated into everyday life. So, yeah, that in a way, I suppose that landscape was where my interests were forged initially, and in many respects, I've been trying to work out those questions. In the 30 years that I've been doing this kind of work. And sociology gave me a home. That's why I'm very loyal to sociology as a discipline, even though I'm not always so sure how welcome I am within it, to be honest with you, in some parts of our discipline. Perhaps I'm not disciplined enough for them. But I am extremely grateful for, having an intellectual home where those kinds of questions were admissible. And Goldsmiths being the department that it is, when I moved there, Paul Gilroy was working there. He was a friend before, but became a long-standing friend. So the things that Paul was writing about, that book that was published in 1987, Ain't No Black in the Union Jack,
Mm.
was such a profound and powerful book in trying to make sense of those things that I thought were important.
Great. And you just mentioned Paul. Who else really kind of inspired you? Were there any other writers that really influenced your own work?
Yeah, you see, I think many actually. I mean, I'm just looking at the bookshelves, around me, and I kind of collect them. It's almost like friends that you need to have close by to help you out. I mean, obviously, Paul was a huge influence on me, but so too were his influences like Stuart Hall, and what cultural studies had become. In a way, it had collected this kind of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary group of people who were writing about, the experience of everyday life with a feel for that experience at the same time with a kind of commitment to theoretical ideas. So I was massively influenced by Paul, and Stuart Hall, and those people. But also, when I was at Goldsmiths, I've only really sort of reflected on this now. When I was at Goldsmiths, the warden of Goldsmiths College was Richard Hoggart. And Richard Hoggart wrote this extraordinary book in 1957 called The Uses of Literacy. Hoggart was a scholarship boy. He'd grown up in a working class community in Hunslet in Leeds. And in a way, that book was an attempt to give an account of that. He wasn't a sociologist by any means, although I think he had a tremendous sort of sensibility as a kind of literary ethnographer. He used his own life in a way as a resource to make sense and interpret and describe in an incredibly thick and vivid way what those communities were like and how they were being transformed with the emergence of mass culture, with rock and roll, with all of the, the beginnings of what becomes consumer culture. And Hoggart, I think, although I didn't realize it until much later, was very influential on me in that he was really interested in how the unfolding of life worked, and how the sort of sensuality of life and also of experience, how to write about that. I mean, that book is extraordinary. There's so much in it that's about, tastes and smells. He was influenced again by George Orwell, I think. He writes in this incredibly vivid way. There's a passage in it that I always love to go back to, which describes why, tinned salmon was such a luxury in working communities, and how the taste of tinned salmon was different from, fresh salmon or whatever. Something about it. So yeah, Hoggart was a massive influence on me. But also, I was taught by, the first wave really of feminist anthropologists. So people like Patricia Kaplan. There's a massive influence on me. I really admired that work, and as a young man was introduced to feminist anthropology, critical gender studies, critical masculinity studies, and I used to go in my spare time with my mate and watch Vic Seidler lecture at Goldsmiths in the sociology department, and he taught a course on Marx and Freud with no notes. So, you would sit at the back of the old lecture theatres, which were incredibly uncomfortable, in not even a comprehensive school in Croydon was that uncomfortable to sit in. We would sit in the bleachers at the back, just trying not to be too conspicuous, and watch him. And he would sort of walk up and down and explain Marx's theory of alienation, or he'd sort of pontificate on, Freud's analysis of dreams. It was incredibly spellbinding, So I used to crash a lot of sociological lectures in those days. Well, the ones that I thought were really good, actually.
Yeah. And for those people listening who perhaps don't know much about your work, what are your main areas of interest, main areas of writing?
Well, they sort of echo the things that I've talked about, So my first really serious piece of research was an ethnography of young people growing up in Southeast London in the 1980s. It was an ethnography of two youth clubs, really, in two very close neighbourhoods that were just a mile apart. One was a predominantly white estate, and it was that way because of the sort of racist allocation procedures, which basically excluded black people from it. It was kind of a cut above this particular estate, and then one which was more profound. So I was interested in the way in which the city is both a place of encounter and of bridging and of cultural dynamism. At the same time, the city is a place where hard, brutal, sometimes murderous forms of division are imposed along the lines of race and race through the workings of racism, I should say. So that was my first thing. But then after that, I sort of developed those themes really as a kind of jobbing researcher. So I wrote a series of books with a wonderful person who helped me massively called John Solomos. We wrote a textbook called Racism and Society together. I was his researcher. We did a piece of research together on racism and local politics in Birmingham, which took me to Birmingham for, best part of a decade. And then we wrote a book about racism and in football called The Changing Face of Football together. So, again, those themes which were established early, always interested in popular culture. So sport and music always seemed to me to be a very vivid place to think about and take bearings on how the culture is changing and how the culture is also reproducing itself too, so that tension between change and reproduction, or the recycling or the circling round. So, those were my first interests. And in many respects, I suppose, the fact that I was a jobbing researcher for such a long time, there weren't teaching jobs. I didn't get a teaching job until I'd been sort of working in this field for almost 10 years. Has meant that, later on, when I made the transition into the classroom, I've been really interested in writing about the craft of doing research. So there's a series of books that are really about that, one called Live Methods with my friend Nirmal Puwar. But the book, which was the kind of crossroads book for me, was a book that I wrote over 10 years ago now called The Art of Listening, which tries to exemplify, what's important about what we do in the field of sociology through examples and through an engagement with the practice of thinking, listening, and writing about the world. So yeah, and I've sort of had this, I've followed my passions in terms of particular areas and fields and research projects. And then I guess in a way, a lot of my work has been about reflecting on why that matters, what's valuable about it. And actually an argument for not just sociology, but for thinking critically and education in a broader sense.
Great. Thanks, Les. And I wanted to talk about some of those in particular. You mentioned Changing Face of Football. That's the first of your work that I read.
Okay, wow.
I couldn't believe it when I look back that it's almost 20 years old now.
I know.
That's unbelievable.
I can't believe either.
But for those who perhaps haven't read it or don't know about it, could you just tell us a little bit about the research and the study?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I forgive me for saying this, but the sociology of sport can be a very sort of fractious and not very comfortable place to be. I don't know why it is. Well, I have a theory about why it is, but it's not that interesting. But it is a very fractious. So I've always thought sport was really, really important and interesting. Partly because I had this kind of ghost life as a young person. The reason why I went to Goldsmiths College was because it was the closest university to Crystal Palace National Sports Centre. At that time, as a 19-year-old, I was completely obsessed with basketball. I was on the cusp of breaking into the England national team. I was on the cusp of making it into the sort of equivalent in the UK of the professional leagues. I'd won a scholarship to study in America. So, sport was everything to me. And that's why I went to Goldsmiths. So it wasn't for a heady thought through at all, actually. And when I look back now, I mean, I love sport. I love basketball so much. It was my whole life, The irony was that after a year of spending most of my time in a gym or, playing in the European Cup around Europe and not in the classroom, I was on the cusp of being thrown out of Goldsmiths College, and I had to give it up to finish my degree. But the thing that I want just to go back to is that it made me realize that, the kind of intimate, up close negotiations around questions of race and ethnicity and of masculinity that happen in the locker room, that happen when you're alongside your teammates and they're being racially abused, or, that they're processing what's going on in the world more broadly, all those things were incredibly influential to me. So sport as a place where those kind of questions about, success or the aspiration for success or redefining what it is, who we are. In a way, I had a gut intuitive sense that something important was happening there because I was living through it, was living through the transition of basketball going from a white middle class game to becoming a much more diverse inner city game.
Yeah.
I was right on the pivot of that and saw the disquiet that the white coaches had with a multiracial locker room and how they couldn't cope with it often, actually. So all of those things, how those things were unfolding within the field of sport, seemed very close to me. And the project about football, in a way, was linked to that. I mean, just before I tell you about that, I remember so vividly. I had a very, very, very close friend called Steve Waters, who went on to be a very famous musician, actually a bass player. Steve and I played in the same team. His mother, Mrs. Waters, was like a kind of surrogate auntie to me. I would go and play music with them in their house and hang out in their house. She was a nurse. She was one of the Windrush generation. But I remember one time so vividly. This was one of those moments you thought, oh, there's serious stuff going on in the world that I need to think about. So I'm in their front room with Steve and I, and we're playing music together, actually. And the white coach from Crystal Palace junior team, sort of incubator team, visits her, comes in the house, because he wants Steve to come back and play basketball. His mum had said, enough of that. You need to concentrate on your schoolwork, give up that sports stuff. The thing that's going to matter to you, as a black woman who was aspirant, is your education. You need to focus on your education. The coach had come to try and lure him back onto the court, and Mrs. Waters was having absolutely nothing of it. So there's this very testy exchange between, incredibly articulate, thoughtful, I guess Chupa is probably 35 or 40 maximum at the time. She seemed wise to me anyway. And this, the white coach. And at one point, she just turns to him and said, you see these two boys? She points at me and Steve. She said, in my house, there's no difference between them. There's no difference between these two boys in my house. When these two boys walk out of my front door, and she's pointing to the door, the world sees a black boy and a white boy.
Yeah.
And it was one of those moments I shall never forget it. I just thought, yeah, that is how the world works.
Yeah.
Deep sociological lesson. I didn't get it from a textbook, but, I remembered it. So I was really, sport became such an interesting and important place for those things to be reckoned with and understood. So the project with John Solomos and Tim Crabb that led to the changing face of football, because it felt like there was another pivotal moment happening at the beginning of doing that project. It was just at the time of the Let's Kick Racism Out Football campaign, and as that was emerging, Tim had been very much involved in that campaign. Football grounds seemed to me at that time, and they've become so again. It's funny how these things kind of come back. They were the largest public context where open racism could be expressed, on a mass scale. There was a very, very pivotal moment that's described in the book. John Solomos, those who followed his very extensive career as a theorist of race and racism, will also know from the credits in his book that he's obsessed with the Baggies, West Bromwich Albion. He's an obsessive West Bromwich Albion fan. In fact, when I was working for him as a researcher, I used to have to meet him before the games in central Birmingham in the Bullring, to talk about our research project. Then he would go to the football. And then when I got to know him a little bit later, I would go with him. Anyway, the beginning of that project really was around a particular fixture where Crystal Palace, South London team, which at that point, had more black players playing on in the first team than white players, and West Bromwich Albion, who had a history of having very important black presences on their team. Laurie Cunningham, Cyril Regis, Brendan Batson, the 3 degrees, as Ron Atkinson called them. But at that point, it was an all-white team. So there's a predominantly black team and an all-white team playing on the on the edge of Handsworth in Birmingham, profoundly multicultural city, predominantly white crowd, and the intensity of the racism that day that John and I witnessed in the crowd was really just dizzying, And the thing that was so tough and difficult and unsettling and disturbing, actually, was that in the midst of that crowd, John and I, his sort of cultural background, born and raised in London, but his family came from Cyprus, Greek Cypriot family. He's deeply connected to these sort of post-colonial movement in sociology. Anyway, we're standing in the middle of that crowd, unable to say anything or feeling like we couldn't. After that game, it's looking back, it was a really defining moment. After that game, I think time passed, and then I met Tim Crabb, and we started to dream up this idea of a project. And so I asked John whether he would come in on it, because he had a track record of getting large research grants. So we got a grant to do that project from the Economic and Social Research Council. And Tim and I were effectively the ethnographers and researchers, and we focused on 4 clubs. And we had a sort of sense that there was something interesting about the relationship between the way in which the local politics of race and class worked compared to what was going on at the national level. So, we had an awful lot of fun doing the project. I mean, there were some times that were really scary. We were in the midst of scary context like that one I was describing at the Hawthorns, but there were lots of others too, being quite close to violent racism, quite close to violence, although, in a way the book is trying to say, well, actually, we need to decouple our understanding of the relationship between sport and power from the obsession with hooliganism.
Yeah.
What we found immediately was that the hooligan firms were much more multicultural than the so-called respectable groups of fans, Yeah. And in terms of how, race and class and masculinity works in terms of negotiations and stuff. So there were loved, prestigious members of some of those hooligan firms. At the same time, as the same groups of fans could indulge in the most grossest forms of open racism.
Yeah. I don't know if someone like Cass Pennant from the ICF, the West Ham hooligan, he's quite prominent, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, there are lots of people like Cass Pennant. There was a guy called Tiny at Millwall who, was tiny, but he was also, both feared and loved and revered. There were lots of examples of that. And so we actually got some fantastic reflective work, accounts from people who were inside that, black football fans who had recognised how, on the one hand, there were these negotiations constantly going on between, people who could be drawn in and become one of us at the same time as, others being vilified. I remember at Millwall, actually. Millwall was one of our case studies, and Millwall was my local team, and I was a fan of Millwall. There was a centre-back called Tony Witter who played for Millwall during this period in the 90s, who was a great player, actually, not brilliantly skilled, but very passionate. Mm-hmm. And I remember there was a game with Ian Wright and Tony Witter playing against each other. And just being in the crowd and people going, go on, Tony, as he did a slide tackle into Ian Wright and sort of basically knocked the ball away, but also took away Ian Wright's legs. So cheering Tony Witter, and then the moment the ball was knocked into touch, there'd be a chorus of monkey chants directed at Ian Wright.
Yeah.
How can that be? They're two people who are more or less identical in terms of their cultural biographies.
Yeah.
One being loved and one being vilified. And Tony Witter had a very profound insight into that. He said it's almost like I'm playing with the shirt over my head. All people see is the shirt.
Yeah.
And just how complex and contingent those inclusions are. And I suppose that's what we were really interested in, how those things were being negotiated.
Yeah, because it strikes me, even, we're talking 20 years after you wrote the study. I'm a season ticket holder myself at Brighton. I've been to nearly every ground up and down the country. And even when you do go to places like Millwall or Crystal Palace, Brighton's local rivals,
Yeah,
Croydon is a very multicultural city, but inside the ground, the fans are still predominantly white.
yeah,
Why do you think
absolutely.
there's still an underrepresentation of black and ethnic minority fans in the ground? What's going on there, Les?
Well, I think it's what the club symbolises. I mean, that's the thing that I thought was I've been so fascinated by, and it's not just a London phenomenon; it's a phenomenon of our other cities around the country too. Is that the football ground itself and the club symbolically comes to be a kind of marker of a particular kind of place symbolically, even when that sense of place is out of step with the rhythm of what's going on around it. So that on Saturday afternoons and other times now, when people are coming to home games, they're coming home to a kind of symbolic, historical place that is really an artifact of a sense, an imagination of community, not as a everyday banal reality, but as a sort of staged symbolization. It's a symbolic moment, and it can be a part of that area's past that's being symbolized around the football club itself. But that's so fascinating to me, So
Yeah.
the fact that the fans remain less diverse than the area that is being, pridefully celebrated through the football songs and through the chants,
Yeah.
South London is wonderful, all that sort of stuff. It's a particular version of what South London is in the case of Crystal Palace and in the case of Millwall, for that matter, and other clubs. So it's a really fascinating way to think about how community and representations of belonging are always about symbolic and processes that are deeply selective.
Yeah. But it also doesn't seem to represent what's changing on the pitch, because there are far more black and minority ethnic players than ever before. As you mentioned, some clubs, it might even be more than white players, but it's still not being reflected in the stands.
It's not been reflected in the stands, and it's not that I think that those communities don't love football. Of course they do. That's what we learn so much about, the affinities and connections and sensibilities of football fans of colour through doing the project. It's not about that at all, actually. It's about whether or not those fans feel at home in those spaces. And I think the truth is that they largely, or that many people largely don't feel at home in those spaces still. I mean, although things are changing, which I think is important to be mindful of and to recognise too, I think that's a very important. It's important not to kind of reduce our understanding of things with our sort of sociological concepts and categories. I had a fantastic experience. I got the long straw actually, because Tim and I both followed the England and the Jamaican team.
Yeah.
In the France World Cup. I think I had a much better time than him actually. I think he still secretly holds it against me. Just traveling, with the reggae boys and girls, it was an amazing thing. Just thought, well, this is a different sense of what it means to be a football fan. I remember having a fantastic experience on the coach going to one of the games in Paris, actually, from London. And so I just happened to be, didn't go with anyone. I just went on my own, and I met people. And did my best to give an account of what it was that I was doing, apart from having a lot of fun and drinking a lot of red stuff actually on the way, which I'm sure, I hope didn't colour my ethnographic attention as much as it might have done. But I had a wonderful moment, sitting on the coach. I think it might have been coming back, not going to the game, coming back, when I was sitting next to a young woman, who was of Jamaican heritage but had grown up in London. I think she was working as a legal secretary, and we got talking, and she said, I think it's the story's told in the book actually. She said something about, oh, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm writing this book about football and how it's changing, and the World Cup is going to be one of the chapters in the book. And I had wanted to follow the Reggae Boys through this tournament. And she said, oh yeah, what's that? And I said, it's a kind of sociological study. She turned back to me and said, I really don't like sociology. And I said, well, why is that then? And she said, well, you're always putting people into boxes.
Mm.
You're always fixing things. You're always reducing me to a category. And I thought, well, you know what? That's a deep lesson.
It's not for everyone.
No, it's not for everyone, but that's a risk,
Yeah.
We have to be careful about, reducing to the world and what we see and what we are listening to, what we encounter, reducing that to the categories that we think with. I say all the time when I'm working with students, what is it that is emerging from what you've seen and heard and are compelled by and fascinated by that makes us think differently about how, whatever the processes are, what is it that emerges from the things that you're encountering and are surprised by that make us think differently?
Yeah, thanks, Les. That's a nice point to end on for part one. And in part two, I'm going to continue my chat with Les Back from Goldsmiths University. Hi, welcome back to part two of the Sociology Show. I'm chatting to Les Back from Goldsmiths University. Les, I don't know if this is a sensitive question or how you go about answering it, but how have you found studying race and racism from the point of view of being white yourself? Has that ever been a problem, an obstacle, or have you faced criticism at all?
Well, it's the question. If you've done the kind of work that I've tried to do throughout my life, really, that question is posed every day. And you have to think about that. I mean, I feel somewhat out of time with some of the debates that are unfolding, particularly in the digital world, around these questions. Because, when people say to me, well, why did you focus on the things that you focused on? Well, because actually, as a young white kid growing up in London in the midst of the 1970s, in the midst of a crisis around race and racism and class, in a profoundly racist and profoundly multicultural city, everyone is shaped by that experience. Everyone. Now, you might not experience what it feels like to be the subject of race and to be the focus of it, but by God, you experience the process of the reproduction of racism, what you're expected to agree with, the arguments that happen over the kitchen table at dinner time over what's going on in the factory or what's going on at school. That stuff is as close as life itself.
Yeah.
So there was no choice for me. I didn't choose it. That's what was happening. Those were the most urgent things that in my mind that mattered, not to some, it's why, I went to go, I left home in 1981. It was the year of the New Cross fire. 13 young black people of my age died that night. The circumstances of that fire, which was literally one street away from the Goldsmiths College and 3 streets away from where I was living at the time, every day I walked past that house, and it was like a kind of scar that was burnt into the cityscape, that charred building. 13 young people had their futures stolen that day, and then a 14th victim died 2 years later. Now, that wasn't some remote category of person, the other, the different, the exotic. That was somebody you could have been sitting next to in class. They were people you were passing on the street. That legacy and that experience, that history, I think I'm still shaped by that.
Mm.
We had an extraordinary experience a few years ago of um, an exhibition of Von Ware's photography, who documented the demonstration that happened after the New Cross fire, the Black People's Day of Action, which was a really historic moment. And she documented that march and incredibly vivid portraits, of young people and groups of people demonstrating that experience. I mean, it's incredibly vivid now, given what's happening. What we're seeing not only in America, but what we're seeing in every city, actually. That violence reproducing itself.
Yeah.
And what was extraordinary about the exhibition was it was a real meeting place. Goldsmiths College was a white island in a post-colonial sea in those days. It's less so now, but it still has the legacy of that. And it was there were I was kind of behind the scenes, just making it happen. But it was a wonderful experience of people coming into the college, seeing those images, and sometimes seeing images of themselves as younger people on that march, from the vantage point of being middle-aged, of showing their children and their grandchildren in some cases. Linton Kwesi Johnson, the dub poet who studied sociology at Goldsmiths, actually, who was on that march, came and wrote a review of the photographs. It's a very precious thing, actually. But anyway, so it was a kind of moment where it felt like the institution and its locality had been bridged in terms of its past, but also of its present. But I talked to some of the families who lost loved ones, and there was one experience actually which I'll never forget. One of the sister of one of the victims of the fire. I won't say who it was because it would be betraying a confidence. But anyway, she just took me to one side. I'd made some mistakes actually in pulling it together, which had to be rectified. And so some of it, and it was testy, but it was respectfully done, And I just said, okay, if you're not happy with that, I'm going to change it. It comes back to this question of, well, what does it mean to do this work if you're white and you're a committed anti-racist? Well, you have to listen and you have to change, and you have to honor with humility and respect the people that you are working with. So anyway, that was the context of this. But the important thing was after these changes had happened, she sat me down and said, why are you doing this? Why does this matter to you?
Yeah.
And I said to her, the truth of it is, that your brother is 3 months older than me. And I'm very acutely aware that the future and the time that I have enjoyed and the things that I have had was stolen from him. So that's why I do it.
Yeah. And it's interesting you say about the current debates, because I do find it really, really difficult. I should just mention to the listeners, we're currently in the George Floyd, well, let's call it what it is, murder,
Exactly.
a week on from then. And as a white individual myself, I've ended up not posting or tweeting anything, actually, because I really don't know whether I should just sit back and listen, whether I should just soak it up, whether I should have a view myself. If I do have a view, should I broadcast it? Should I be quiet? It's really, really difficult. I'm not sure where you stand on that, Les.
Well, I think I've got a lot to say about this. We have to listen. That's the first step, But I think the thing about it is that what makes me think hard about the way things have shifted is that, in a way, there are two really important things. It's how to be connected to and affiliated and believe in a different kind of world and be an anti-racist as a white person, with humility and with respect, and not to try and colonize the moral high ground or to become a voice, when actually sometimes the best thing to do is to listen.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I would say. But at the same time, the inhibition and the falling in on oneself, I think shame is a profoundly productive and important affect as an emotion, to feel shame and ashamed. And I think we should all feel ashamed of what we have seen. You know, the brute, barbaric face of police racism, that you know, unself-conscious. You know, that video of the murder of George Floyd is unbearable to watch for its violence, but also the fact that that police officer is completely indifferent to what he is hearing. You know, at one point, one of the passers-by says, you know, he's a human being, you know. Now, it feels to me the last thing, humility and respect is so important from my point of view. You know, that has been the only way to do the kind of work that I've tried to do with any sense of honor, actually.
Yeah.
I leave it for others to decide, but that's what I want to try and do, and what I've tried to do all my work in life, really, because it's not that it's just somebody else's issues. These are issues that affect us all, you know. But there's part of me of that inhibition and the lack of speech and the falling in on one's self as a white subject, or as somebody who's characterized as white, is something that I think, you know, is very destructive. You know, guilt, inward lookingness, you know, those kinds of affects and emotions can become incredibly destructive. You know, they can feed resentment. They can feed kind of quiet resistance that is unspoken. You know, I think that's very dangerous and toxic turn, if you like.
Yeah. Do you know what? That's exactly what I've been seeing over Twitter the last few days. That there's, you know, it becomes mudslinging, but on one side we've seen, you know, white people should be ashamed of what they've done in their history and so on. And then I've seen many white posters bite back and say, but I haven't done anything. You know, this happened years ago. I haven't done anything. And that is why I've stayed out, because there's a part of me that thinks, do you know what? I'm not going to get involved.
Well, you know, and that's, in a way, that's part of the privilege of whiteness. I don't mean that in a disrespectful way.
No, I agree, Les, yeah.
And in a way, I think, you know, it's that is an action.
Yeah.
I'm talking in a general sense.
Yes, certainly.
Not me, it's not about me. These are not my issues. Yeah, they are about you. They are your issues. They are part of the world in which you're implicated deeply every day, you know, in ways that you are either conscious of or not. So, you know, I mean, I think it goes back to lots of the things we've talked about. It's funny, it wasn't planned, but, you know, if you're having to encounter and think about those things in real time in Mrs. Walter's front room, if that's what you're living every day, there's a lesson in that, you know, and there's a complexity to it that maybe isn't quite the same as, you know, 140 characters on Twitter.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think one of the things, I'm an enthusiast for the opportunities that our new informational environment afford us as sociologists. But equally, I think our times are absolutely dogged with certainty, with political certainty. You know, I think we live in a society in a moment that suffers from certainty rather than doubt. You know, and I think doubt can be paralyzing, but it also can be profoundly provoking in making us think differently. Should I do this? Shouldn't I do this? Now, you know, the questioning, I think, is productive. If it leads to paralysis, then the legacy of racism wins.
That's true.
Or not the legacy of it, the fact of it now. So that's my feeling about it. You know, and I feel like I've been very lucky in that. Well, maybe not lucky. I don't know the right word. I feel privileged, actually.
Yeah.
And in this sense, I would use that word. That, you know, I've been in contexts where the people that I've worked with and admired have recognized the sincerity of where that desire to what Bron Ware and I call stepping out of whiteness, of trying to transcend that and realizing that's a really difficult, maybe even impossible thing to do, but to, you know, to challenge those things from inside, and to develop a different kind of sensibility, I suppose. And that's, I don't think that's about, some sort of, there's a lot of phrases that get circulated, savior, all this sort of stuff. It's not about that at all, actually.
Yeah.
It's not about that at all. It's about, facing the world as it is and facing one's own implication in that world.
I think you've hit on exactly what I was trying to get at, that you want to come across with sincerity without being criticized as a savior or virtual signaling or whatever other terms come about. And maybe that's weak of me, but sometimes it has felt easier just to sit back because of fear of those tags or labels, I guess.
Well, I don't think you can fake sincerity. I know that doesn't sound very psychological, but I don't think you can. One's actions aren't necessarily the result of, a tweet, but they're, I think it's an accumulation of things, maybe, it's an accumulation of things. Yeah, as I say, I think it's extraordinary, the sort of information environment that we live in now, and its capacity to link, point, share. But I do think that, those certain judgments that are thrown around, thinking is a difficult thing. And these issues are difficult. Sometimes they're brutally simplified in the violence of them. But actually really thinking about this legacy, the legacy of racism in our culture, in the way it is not something that's shaped it from the core of its history, of its historical formation. Thinking about that is a very hard task, and a careful task it's a life's work, really. I think. Many people, and many people who I admire have been absolutely committed to that. But name calling isn't thinking. Name calling flattens, it reduces. It's the effective power of it might come from a good place, but I think in a way the value of sociology is to it comes down to some very simple things about finding resources to think about the world and our place within it, and also to think differently about the things which everyone else is so certain about.
Yeah, I wanted to try and put a bit more of a positive thing on it. There's in the time that you've been studying race and racism, you must have seen some developments, some improvements. What have you seen that's changed for the good?
It's very hard to really to take stock. I mean, there are some things that I think there are realities now that would not have happened in the early part of my experience of being in education. I think about this in the classroom a lot. I think the shifts and changes that I think of as progress are uneven, and they are not linear. They're uneven. They shift forwards and backwards. John Solomon and I once characterized racism as a kind of scavenger ideology. And we were inspired by George Mosse, the great theorist of Nazism and historian of Nazism. I think racism is a scavenger ideology. It moves, it shifts, it changes, it adapts in order to hold on to its power, or to the power of its discourse. So I don't think we can think about a linear progressive movement at all, actually. How could we, in the context of what we've witnessed, on our mobile phones around the violence of the murder of George Floyd, How could we believe that in that? At the same time, the idea that there's no change also seems to kind of not recognize those things that are shifting. And I think of it in the classroom. The classrooms that I sat in as a young undergraduate in 1981, in a world in a profoundly post-colonial world that's at that gate of the university, how different they seem, some in uneven but important ways, than some of the experiences of people that I work with and teach now. Their challenges are considerable, but one of my one of the best relationships I've had in my time as a teacher, really, and as a sociologist too, is with a man that I first met on an Access to Higher Education open day at Goldsmiths. I remember going in, just to give you an example of what of progress that I believe in. So I go to this Access open day for students who are thinking about studying at university, and in the crowd, I recognised one of the people there. He's a young-ish, he's probably in his 30s at this point, black man who I recognised as a dancehall DJ. I'd seen him perform on reggae sound systems.
Yeah.
So anyway, I talked about things I thought were important, the legacy of the power of music in this particular part of London, which has a very rich history of sound system culture. You know, some of the biggest and most important reggae sound systems were in Lewisham, the place where Goldsmiths College is located. You know, some of those sound systems were literally down the street, playing across the street. And, you know, one of the DJs, part of that incredible moment, was William Henry. And I met him that day, and he ended up coming and studying social anthropology, and then left anthropology and joined the sociology department and wrote his PhD on the experience of dancehall DJs. The book was published. He published it himself, actually, called What the DJ Says. Brilliant book about, perhaps the best book about dancehall culture and sound system culture that's ever been published, about the London experience particularly. Anyway, Les Henry just became a professor of criminology at the University of West London this year. He's had an incredibly tough journey through that. But when I look back, you know, the travel that he's made in his life, that isn't nothing. That is something, an extraordinary achievement. And although there is profound resistance within the university system, and the move towards a truly open, democratic, and multiracial university is a long way away, there are small shifts, small cracks. And it's in those small cracks that I think that there has been meaningful change.
That's a lovely story to end on that, Les, because unfortunately we've kind of run out of time for our podcast.
Okay, well, it's been a pleasure.
Could I just ask you to let the listeners know where they can read more about your work? You're on Twitter. Where else can they find out about your information?
You can find out more about the things I do. I'm not very good at this, actually. But I'm an enthusiast for Twitter. I share loads of stuff, and you can find me at Academic Diary, which is my Twitter handle. I have a lecture series that's free and open on SoundCloud called the Lockdown Lectures. You can listen to me there if you'd like to. You can also access a lot of my publications through the Goldsmiths website. We have an open access portal there. You can find a lot about what I'm doing actually via the Centre for Urban and Community Research space on the Goldsmiths website.
Great. Thanks, Les. It's been wonderful to chat to you today, and thanks for all your input.
No, my pleasure.
Thank you. Cheers, Les.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.